Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It is so wonderful to see all of you here. Welcome to Rhodes House and to this inaugural dialogue in partnership with the World Reimagined and Atelier Zuleika, celebrating the work that we are doing together with World Reimagined here at the Rhodes Trust to engage with painful, difficult, oppressive legacies with honesty and also with a sense of hope and possibility for a better future. And so we're really, really thrilled to have you here. So my name is Elizabeth Quiche. I'm the warden of Rhodes House, and I'm looking around the audience. I hope that all of you have had a chance to see these beautiful globes in our garden and in front of Rhodes House, and also to look around the house. We at the Rhodes Trust have, over the past several lifetimes, actually it's only 2.5 years, but we have renovated the building and expanded it. And it is an opportunity for us in doing that to also reimagine it as we reimagine the Rhodes Trust and the Rhodes Scholarship and the work that we are doing. So with the house, we have been seeking to find more ways to have it be open to the community, to engage with art and history and legacy, to invite people here for open days. We've hosted a number of open days, and to be a hub and a resource for important conversations about the issues that matter to the contemporary world, including our history and how we respond to it, and including questions around technology and social justice, climate change, and many more. So it was as we were preparing to reopen Rhodes House and to celebrate the 120th anniversary of the Rhodes Scholarship that we had the great privilege and joy to be connected with the World Reimagined. An extraordinary effort, and I want to acknowledge Michelle Gale, who's here, who is co-founder of the World Reimagined. An extraordinary effort bringing artists from across the UK to reflect on the enslavement of Africans and how that very painful and difficult history has shaped the modern world. How all of us, how our reality, our privileges are grounded in that history of enslavement and of empire. But if you've seen the globes, as you will have seen, the globes take you on a journey about the past, the present, and the future, and really challenge us and invite us to engage with that history and with what our own responsibilities are in response to that history. Here at the Rhodes Trust, we are embracing that in our own efforts to invest in create more opportunities for young people from Africa and across the global South. And in the work that we are doing to open Rhodes House. And we are really thrilled to be partnering with the World Reimagined and also in hosting dialogues like the one this evening. So I want to thank Michelle and everyone at World Reimagined. I want to thank Lizzie Collins, who is our wonderful art consultant from Atelier Zuleika. Lizzie was the one who connected us along with Nicola Green, who is one of the World Reimagined artists and whose work, if you may have had a chance to see in our gallery. So thank you for your partnership, and also a big thank you to my colleague, our Director of Communications, Babette Littlemore, who has been deeply involved in this partnership with World Reimagined and in all of our open houses and in our kind of our broader efforts to use art to invite people to engage with our legacy and history. So we have an extraordinary panel this evening who will be asking us to consider the cultural and economic impact of redefining the Atlantic Triangle, the triangle that really produced much of the modern world, a triangle around enslavement, empire, and the Industrial Revolution. And what are ways in which we can reimagine, as the World Reimagined asks us and challenges us to do? How can we reimagine that Atlantic Triangle? So I'm delighted to introduce the panel for this evening. And I'm going to introduce all of you and then ask you to please come up to the front. But we have first the chair of the panel is Kehinde Andrews, who is an academic, activist, and author. His newest book is called The Psychosis of Whiteness: Surviving the Insanity of a Racist World. He led the development of the first Black Studies degree in Europe at Birmingham City University and is director of the Center for Critical Social Research and founder of the Harambee Organization of Black Unity and co-chair of the Black Studies Association. So Kehinde, I would invite you to come up. Please welcome Dr. Andrews. We also have on the panel Onyekachi Wambu, who is a Nigerian-British journalist and writer who has directed television documentaries for the BBC, Channel 4, and PBS, and edited the anthology Empire Windrush: Reflections on 75 Years and More of the Black British Experience. Previously, Onyekachi was executive director of the African Foundation for Development, an international organization aiming to expand and enhance the African diaspora's contributions to African development. Please join me in welcoming Onyekachi Wambu. We have with us this evening Councillor Asher Craig, who has served as the ward councillor for St. George West since 2016 and is currently deputy mayor and cabinet member for Children's Services, Education and Equalities, having previously held the role of cabinet member for Communities, Equalities and Public Health. Councillor Asher Craig. And last but certainly not least, one of our own, I'm delighted to welcome to the panel Muloongo Muchelemba, who is a Zambian Rhodes Scholar who left the corporate world after 16 years working in banking, consulting, and the energy sector to focus on identifying and nurturing young global talent. She is director of selection for our RISE program, which selects young people 15 to 17 around the world and brings them together. Outside of work, Muloongo is the founder and content creator of Onyekachi, a Pan-African thought leader and ideas blog that seeks to shift the narratives around Africa. Please join me in welcoming Muloongo.
Okay, so thank you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'll be your chair for the evening. One thing I do have to clarify first is when do you want us to open to Q&A? Because I don't want to go on. We can just go on forever and you don't have no questions. At quarter past. Yes, cool. All right, I'm also going to hand out waters. In my duty as host, I'll be there you go. Here's water. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Could you bring the table?
Oh yeah, I can bring the table too. There we go. Let's get even better. Look at that. I got it. It's fine.
Yeah.
I've done this before.
Thank you. Not exactly in front of me, but.
Oh no, but you don't want to. Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought there'd be whiskey there.
I thought there'd be chicken wings, but I always get disappointed when I look for them. Anyway, so we're going to start the conversation today very much about the Atlantic Triangle. We're in an interesting stage where things are happening around parts of the world. And really interestingly, things are happening in parts of the world which are usually seen to be more conservative. So Barbados has recently decided to get rid of the British monarch as the head of state. Barbados is also known as Little England. Very, very, very colonial. You kind of think Jamaica's the place where everybody's rowdy, but Jamaica still has King Charles as head of state. Francophone Africa has a reputation, again, for being more, because of French colonialism, is a very particular a very particular thing. And historically, Pan-Africanism and the more revolutionary Pan-Africanism was definitely not in Francophone Africa, but it's Niger and it's Mali who have kicked out the French and are trying to get proper money for their resources. So I guess my opening question to everybody is, what does it say that it is these supposedly more conservative parts of the Black diaspora, Black Atlantic, who are really trying to transform the notion of the Atlantic Triangle? And anybody can start. Anybody want to go?
So let me just kick off as the child of the Caribbean. My parents are Jamaican, and I never really looked at it from that perspective of it being I just applauded the fact that Barbados have made that huge step. Whether they're conservative or liberal, it doesn't make any difference around their politics or politics. What I was interested in is that it was so time for us to kind of sever the ties that bind us to the Commonwealth, and so I have to. You have to consider who their leader is, because change happens when you see change in leadership. And the leadership of Barbados, I wouldn't necessarily call her conservative with a big C or a little c. She is somebody who has been absolutely kind of powerful and determined in her efforts to set the Caribbean, but in particular Barbados, free. So I am extremely excited because I'm going to be joining a discussion that the Jamaican High Commission is actually organising in a few days' time to start the conversation with the wider diaspora here in the UK to get our views on what we feel about, because the change is going to happen and it's going to roll. What's going to be important is, as a region, and if it's Jamaica, Trinidad, and everyone who comes after that, it's how we coalesce around each other, how we support each other, how are we going to make this republic actually work? And I was thinking about the economics of it all as well, and I know there wasn't a question around it, but I'm really fascinated in the BRICS situation and seeing, and I'm so proud at this moment in time of seeing that direction of travel, and I want to see that kind of same impetus happening from the Caribbean states as well, and maybe joining in with BRICS as a new power base that doesn't have to follow the dollar, So yeah, I'm just extremely excited about what's to come, that we are taking back control of our lives.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to speak on Africa. So just going back to providing context for maybe some of the people sitting here and trying to figure out why we're talking about the Atlantic Triangle. Is the sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And so just to give context, I mean, the Atlantic Triangle, the foundation of the Atlantic Triangle is really the exploitation of the African continent. And the dynamics that we saw in the 16th to 19th century where we saw Europe bringing finished goods to Africa, taking slaves to the Americas and picking up cotton, tobacco, sugar, and other products to take back to Europe, which is the foundation Elizabeth mentioned. That dynamic has not changed. The exploitation continues to this day in the guise of international trade. And when you look at what's happening in Francophone Africa, they're really trying to end that continued exploitation. And to understand that, you have to look at the colonial pact that France signed with its former colonies when they granted independence. And I'm assuming some people may not know, so I'll just add a little bit of context. When France granted independence around 1960, countries signed an agreement, which quite frankly I find shocking, which was multifaceted and gave France control over monetary policy and economic policy. They used the CFA franc, which interestingly still stands for French colonies of Africa. I'm surprised they've kept that name. But CFA franc was actually introduced during colonialism in 1945 to help settlers in the colonies still trade with France. And after independence, that system continued, but it also required these countries to deposit all their foreign exchange reserves with the Banque de France. That was changed to just 65% in 1973, and then 50% for West Africa in 2005. But that system of exploitation has continued with literally, I think I've seen a number of $5 billion in total has gone from the colonies to France, which I think I just saw someone described as repayment for benefits of colonization, which is also shocking. Several aspects of the colonial pact where France had the right to intervene militarily in these countries. So if you've been following what's been happening in Niger, Emmanuel Macron was extremely reluctant to remove the 1,500 troops that are stationed in Niger because France has a right to defend their economic interests according to the pact. The pact also gave French companies the right of first refusal for any government contracts in any of these colonies. And it also gave them access to natural resources. So again, back to Niger, one of the first things the military did when they took over was they started charging France commercial rates for uranium. So 15% of France's uranium comes from Niger. France was paying 80 cents per kilo. The market rate is 200 euros per kilo. And they said you have to pay market rates. So that exploitation has been going on to this very day, even though most of these countries have been independent since the 1960s. And so what you're seeing that's driving this change is this resentment has been building for a very long time. So in 2015, the president of Chad said, for Africa to develop, we have to cut this cord with France. This was 2015. And then what's been happening recently is I love the youth because a lot of this revolution is being driven by the youth. So if you look at the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, he's only 34 years old, the military ruler. And then Assimi Goïta in Cote d'Ivoire is only 38 when he did the first coup, is now in his early 40s. But the youth are seeing the status quo and are saying enough is enough. So one thing I forgot about the Franc-Afrique arrangement was that France determined who ruled these colonies. Literally, the leaders had to be able to maintain the status quo. And so one live example actually is Equatorial Guinea. The president of Equatorial Guinea has been in power since 1979. His son is the vice president. Last month at the UN General Assembly, he posted a video of himself on Instagram walking through his $75,000 a night suite at the Mark Hotel. And then the next day spoke at the UN General Assembly talking about why Africa has not developed. I mean, it was really astounding. And these are people who are protected by France. And so the reason people are standing up is because they're saying enough is enough. We're seeing these leaders who have failed to develop these countries are perpetuating this system of exploitation, and Africans want to be more in charge of their destiny. And that's what you're seeing across the continent. And now it's starting to spread because people are looking at what Francophone Africa is doing and saying, whoa, we can actually challenge what's been going on.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think my colleagues have really given both sort of micro and macro picture of what the challenges are. And I think you talked about transformation, Kehinde, and I would say challenge rather than transformation. And a number of things happen because it's a bigger system. Yeah, we can talk about France as an example of it, but it's a much bigger system that has been operating for a long time. A number of things happened at a particular point in history in creating this Atlantic space. European countries, small European countries, went south to Africa and then went east after they rounded the Cape. And then they went west to the Americas with Columbus. The world changes as a result of those movements. And by 1452, the Pope issues a papal bull authorizing King Alfonso V of Portugal to reduce any Saracens and pagans and unbelievers to perpetual slavery. So this is a religious edict, and it's coming from the highest sources. And then again, in 1455, again to Alfonso, Nicholas V extends to Catholic nations of Europe dominion over discovered lands during the so-called Age of Discovery that we were just talked about. So along with sanctifying the seizure of non-Christian lands, it encouraged the enslavement of native, non-Christian peoples in Africa and the New World. So the age of discovery, empire and colonization for Europe is unleashed. And in that Atlantic space, it becomes the age of dispossession, slavery, occupation, and second-class citizenship for Africans. And it's constantly challenged from when the Africans are trafficked in the battles for liberation. The first successful one is in Haiti in 1804. And the question is then, a global economic system is being put together. How do you challenge it? And then how do you create different models that might allow sustainability, etc.? In the post-war period, there's this huge opportunity now for decolonization. And we're seeing an incredible challenge. I've just written a book about Windrush, and we're celebrating 75 years of Windrush. And I was trying to argue in an article that I wrote for The Guardian that you could see Windrush as a group of Caribbean people boarding a ship to come to the UK for for a better life and respond to the labour needs in the UK, or you can see it as a harbinger of other forces that are being unleashed in the post-war period. So 48, what happens? A year earlier, India gets its independence. A year later, the Communist Party seizes power in China. And those forces are challenging profoundly with the BRICS and everything else, that modern world that was constructed by Europeans in beginning, I guess, with that papal bull in 1452. And we can see all the tensions that are going on as a result of that. And so if we're going to reimagine the Atlantic world, we have to do it within that broader context. But we're also doing it at a point where the Atlantic world itself is in decline with the rise in the East. Up until 1985, the most incredible and successful trade routes in the world for about 200 years was across the Atlantic. From 1985, it became across the Pacific. So Atlantic is already in decline. And probably by 2030, it's going to be within Asia, the most successful trading route. So the Pacific is going to be in decline, the Atlantic is in decline. And a lot of the arguments that we're having have to do with those broader changes that are happening in the global economy and the challenge to that Euro-Atlantic hegemony. And later on in this conversation, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what I'm calling the African Atlantic and how important that is in the construction of the Atlantic space, and which has been ignored and has been defaulted to the Euro definition of the Atlantic space.
That's interesting. I think one of the things I wanted to follow-up question on this would be, if you think about the transition in the Second World War, so I'm a big Malcolm X fan, so you always hear a Malcolm X quote somewhere. And the Malcolm X quote I'm going to use now is, there's a move after the Second World War to benevolent colonialism. You can't have that European-led, dominated violence after the Second War. It's not going to happen. Europe's bankrupt anyway. People have been fighting in wars, and so you kind of have to switch. And the switch of gears is essentially, Malcolm says, they pass the ball to the United States. The United States becomes the center of empire, etc., and really have that it becomes the heart of the Atlantic. And you're right; it's very Euro or American defined. Why I raise this is because thinking about where the challenge, probably challenge better than transformation, it comes from, is what's happening in Francophone Africa, is that because France was so much more old style colonialism. Like Britain is hands off. There's still colonialism, it's still terrible, but you don't have the CFA franc, it's not as rigid. It's part of the reason why you're having the Francophones fight back is because it's so obvious. Whereas in like Nigeria, it's obvious to me, but it's not obvious to it's not Britain aren't as obvious, and maybe in Barbados it's similar because it feels so colonial when you go to Barbados as opposed to Jamaica. Like there's more resistance. Do we need to have some like openly hostile colonial racism in our faces for us to really come back and challenge the system? Can we not challenge it when it's more insidious? I guess.
I think the point is, of course, you have to, whether it's insidious or not. I mean, we do the same thing with racism that we have to address on a day-to-day basis. It's either in your face, but most of the time it's not in your face. It's covert. It's it's embedded. It's endemic within society. So. As you were all both talking, and I was sitting here, I'm no academic, and I'm never going to pretend to be an academic. I'm just going to give it to you straight from how I'm feeling and how I kind of move through life. But I was sitting here thinking, do you know something? Colonialism is just another. It's just another form of slavery. They just wrote it down on a piece of paper, but we have been enslaved, so don't be fooled by this colonialism tag that we all had, because we have never been free, and that is the reality. And you're absolutely right. I love young people all day, every day, and they're the ones who are going to set us free. And I applaud what those young leaders are doing. But I'm also very wary because I've been loving what is happening around the BRICS situation. I'm thinking, yes, take back control, but what does that actually mean? We need to make sure that you have the kind of infrastructure in place. We're talking about, kind of the economy, financially, socially. We need to make sure that we have our house in order. And the problem that we have, particularly in Africa, we have because of colonial slavery, we have a lot of corruption kind of embedded in the system. And it's interesting to hear you talk about the way in which France and others have put in place different families to kind of rule and just keep things the way they are. Hence why you're having to have these coups, and you might end up having to have many more coups because you've got to break the cycle. But again, it's very endemic, and there's a lot of work to be done, and we just need to kind of put our shoulders to the wheel. But yeah, it's not going to be easy. But I'm ready to join. I'm kind of like watching and thinking, all right, what can I do to help? Particularly given my role as a leader in a city, because I run a city. I don't have to run the city corruptly. I know how to run a city and make it work without having to put money in my back pocket or do something. So I'm thinking maybe I could teach some of these leaders how you can actually run a country or run your city and run it fairly, equitably. Everybody feels like, so there's a lot of work to be done, but kind of that's my contribution. But I'll see to the academic.
I'm not an academic.
I'm not an academic.
I try not to be an academic, so
My learned scholars. Okay.
Did you want to go next?
No, I was just going to say. I mean, I think you're right, and to go back to Kehinde's question. Yes, at the end of the Second World War, something happens, but essentially we construct a global economic system that is not very much unlike the one that was before the war. So, you have the extraordinary situation as a result of that global economic system. If you were in Nigeria and you were running account deficit of 30 trillion, you would have hyperinflation. But if you have the world reserve currency, you can print paper and buy assets anywhere in the world. And how does that operate? What system allows that to happen? So you structure an economic system around, the Bretton Woods system with the World Bank and the IMF, where, governments are told as soon as they hit difficulties that they must sell off all their assets, they must cut services to the poor and everything else, and then who comes in and buys all those assets with printed paper? Yeah, and then who controls the IMF and who controls the World Bank? And then when there's austerity elsewhere in the UK, the Bank of England can print paper, which the Africans can't do. So it's a big structure. And as with the period before when it was crude and brutal, the slave trade, they worked with Africans who did trade. And so the same group are there trading. Abacha sticks, billions in a British bank. We all know that the head of state probably earns 3-4 million if he's lucky. Why does Britain accept 2 billion from Abacha? I mean, there's an agreement, isn't there, that he's allowed to do that. So and then we get the lectures about democracy, and which allow all of this to happen. So it's a system that is constantly challenged, and we're at an interesting moment that the challenge is much more aggressive. And of course, the poor French do it much more crudely.
Can I just make
And not in the kind of sophisticated way that we do it here.
But can I just make I have one warning though about the whole Brit situation. Be careful what you wish for, okay? Because when I talk to my friends, my family, and everyone has a view, back in the day when people think, oh, we don't know what's going on. Let me tell you, see the younger generation, they have a view, and I take notice of what they have to say. And one of their issues is, this is another form of colonialism round in another way, because I see China just stepping in. And I saw it when I went to Gambia, because I went to Gambia about a year and a half ago. And I'm driving along the main road, and I see this huge, it looked like a huge conference facility, lots of flags flying, brand new. Remember, I'm just coming off a road that's half done, being fixed. But I'm seeing this shiny, gleaming, like 50 million, 100 million pounds. Let me tell you, the Gambians love that building. They think, yeah, this is great. And I'm like, but why have they built this here and there's no investment in the rest of the infrastructure? Because as I stepped out of the airport, I'm thinking, things need to be fixed. I'm on a kind of like city. Okay, the roads need fixing, and then boom, there's this Chinese-funded huge building that nobody can get into because that's the other thing. But you can't tell the people anything differently than you need to be kind of careful. They just see, yeah, they're coming, lots of investment is coming, but I'm like, they're sorting their own house out first before they start to really sort out what's really happening in the country. So, yeah, just be careful what we wish for.
Can I say briefly to answer your question? Our experiences are very different. So France was a certain kind of colonial master. The Brits were very different and thankfully hands off. But then that's intersected by our different cultural backgrounds and our institutional development. So if you see in Southern, I think I was talking to somebody, my friend Tanya, about this, how different Southern Eastern Africa are very different to West Africa, where coups have been, like in Zambia where I'm from, we vote, we use the democratic system to bring in and out of our leaders. But in West Africa, including Nigeria up until the 90s, had a history of coups. So there's some cultural dynamics that we have to be aware of. And African issues are very different from Caribbean issues. So when I'm speaking to my Caribbean friends, how we view the English is very different. Our issues, our sense of identity is very different. And one thing I find very interesting when I speak to my Francophone African friends who have a French passport is I have a friend from Togo, and if you ask her what's your nationality, she'll say I'm French, and you're like, oh, you're not really French. Where are your parents from? Togo. Whereas if you ask a Zambian or a Zimbabwean where you're from, I have a British passport. I always say I'm Zambian, and it's just that sense of identity that evolved very differently around Africa and the Caribbean, and that has a huge influence on how we perceive the former colonial powers and how we look at the whole concept of neocolonialism. That's why you're seeing a difference in how people are reacting. We're solving and we're fighting this very differently, and like I say, we like in Southern Africa in the form of dialogue with the West and trying to find some common ground. And Francophone Africa is, probably being a little bit more militant and saying get out of our countries, and it's their prerogative. Their history is very different.
Yeah, but that is part of French colonialism, even in the Caribbean. The idea that you're French, the idea that it's total, the idea you can't really have dialogue because you're just French, right? So yeah, and I guess this is what I'm pulling at. And I think also in the UK and in the West, wherever you are, sometimes you need a villain. Without a villain, it can be harder to really push back. Anyway, so I wanted to move on to the second question, which we talked about the BRICS a bit, but what about the African Union? So we have a body which is supposed to unite Africa. Also talks about, makes nods to bringing in the sixth region of the Caribbean. It's been around for 50 odd years. There's lots of limitations of the African Union. Do you think the African Union can overcome those limitations to actually lead the transformation of the Atlantic Triangle? What do you think? Anybody can answer.
Oh, I can go first. So I've never been a big fan of the AU because their successes are limited compared to their limitations. But I've been increasingly becoming a bit more optimistic about their prospects. And one of the things, interesting developments recently was last month the AU became a permanent member of the G20. So they basically now have a platform in which to have these conversations like the transformation of the Atlantic Triangle. But they do have structural limitations that impede their ability to be successful. And the two main ones are, the first is mandate. So the African Union was formed in September 1999. It superseded the Organization of African Unity, which had been in existence for 1993. OAU had a very clear mandate, and that was to end colonialism and to help countries achieve independence. And that's why you saw the sense of Pan-Africanism develop and countries helping each other. Zambia, for example, hosted freedom fighters from South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and other countries. I remember Nelson Mandela talking about how nurses in Senegal used to contribute $1 a month to help the anti-apartheid struggle. So everyone sort of banded together to make sure that every single country in Africa, so 54 plus Western Sahara, became independent. And OAU basically achieved its mandate by 1999. So it made sense to retire that legacy body and replace it with the AU, which was tasked with driving regional integration, dealing with economic, social, and political issues. But unfortunately for the AU, it came to being when sub-regional bodies had already been in existence for a long time. So East Africa, for example, had an economic community that had been in existence since 1917. So OAU was fighting for independence, but you also had economic bodies. The Southern Africa Development Corporation or community had been in existence since 1980. So by the time AU was formed, you had these sub-regional bodies that had been working and functioning and delivering, and the AU was kind of trying to coordinate amongst them, and that coordination is not happening very well. However, the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, is one of the things that gave the AU some sort of legitimacy, because AU for the first time really stepped up and said, we need a coordinated response to the pandemic. They negotiated with the global powers, the big pharmaceuticals, to get the vaccine for the African continent. And I think people for the first time, including myself as one of the fiercest critics, were giving them the respect that they had long desired. And I think they really do deserve. So that's one structural issue, is the mandate, and being really clear about what are you doing and how can you coordinate better with the sub-regional bodies. And the second bigger problem is financial independence. So in 2021, the AU budget was $623 million. 65% came from external parties. So the EU, the Americas, the US, Japan, and 35% comes from Africa. So if you're having a conversation about transformation of the Atlantic Triangle,
Yeah.
And the people you're holding responsible are the people that are feeding you. How do you bite the hand that feeds you? It's really impossible. So in 2016, the AU gathered all the countries together because they're very good at having meetings. If that's one thing they've done really well, is have really good meetings every year. No disrespect, but I really have questions about the AU. And so they gathered everyone in 2016 in Kigali and said, we need to start funding our own body and become independent. Only 16 countries delivered. And so we're not funding our own body. We want to fight the Western powers, but the Western powers are funding us. It's really difficult. I think what would be a game changer is if the AU and the Africa Development Bank actually partnered and worked the way the EU and ECB work. In Europe, but AFDB also has the same issues that they're 40% funded by the external donors. So I think until Africa achieves financial independence, it is really hard to have these conversations. So mandate and financial independence are the limitations, but I think there is a platform for the African Union to actually become that voice for the continent.
I don't think I have anything more to. You're absolutely right, because I think about, and I'm going to put this into again as you were talking, and I was thinking about leadership and what we've done in Bristol through the leadership of Mayor Marvin Rees, because when he was elected in 2016, he made it quite clear that he was there. He was not the Labour mayor, even though he's the Labour mayor. He's the mayor of Bristol. So regardless of what your political persuasion is or none, he's there representing everybody, race, colour, creed, everything. But he also made clear that the system of leadership was broken in the city, because everybody looks to the council's issue for anything and everything. And he's like, we're just a small little microcosm. In fact, the MOD is one of the biggest players. The NHS is one of the biggest players. We've got, Hargreaves Lansdown, one of the top 10 investment brokers. There's a lot of money in our system, but only the people only know what they need to know. And he said, if we are going to bring the power and the might of the city, if we're going to address some of the real challenges that we face in the city, then he started by gathering a group of 40, 50 leaders across the city. He got them in a room within 6 months, 3-4 months of him coming into power. And, he said on the back of the fag packet, he said, at least 80 billion in that room alone, just if you counted everybody's budgets and put it all together. And he said, if I just asked you for a sliver of your little budget that could help me build houses and address all of these things, then Bristol would be a much bigger place. So what do we have? We have Bristol One City. And let me tell you, it works. Because you see, when you had COVID, if we didn't have the infrastructure that we have in place where the whole city just, we focus on a particular issue, get behind it and get it addressed. When we were dealing with period poverty, when we were dealing with children, school holiday, food for school holidays, and the government turned around and said no to Bristol, we're not going to give you any money for this initiative. Marvin just sent out a letter, and we raised £250,000 in 3 days from everyone in the city, and even some of the businesses during the summer got down to work down there, shoulder to shoulder, making the sandwiches and making sure that every child in our city who needed to be fed. The point I'm making is leadership really does matter. And if you've got the mandate, which Marvin actually has as the mayor of the city, but also, we walk our talk in our city. If we say we're going to do something, we're going to do it. And I think it's about trust, because there's just too much as you said about the African leaders, it's kind of only 16, how many, 54, and only 16 even want to back themselves. So even if you've got to have the right kind of leadership and partnership in place. And clearly there's some aspects of the AU that is broken. I'm going to be doing a lot of homework after this. I'm going to be reading up, because I'm finding what you're both saying extremely fascinating. And that's the other thing as well. We also have to take a lot of people on a journey with us. So don't assume everybody is where we're all at, because I think everyone here is going to take away some nuggets from today, because I know I am. So thank you both for
No, that was,
that.
I was just going to add on the point of the AU is that the AU and the idea of African unity actually develops in the diaspora.
Mm.
Yeah. So if you're going to do this transformation, it has to embody and reflect the Atlantic space. It has to embody and incorporate that bigger idea. And we had the Pan-African conferences and congresses, and the last major one in '45 in Manchester that leads to independence with Nkrumah and W.B. Du Bois and all the Jomo Kenyatta and all the leaders are there. So there's this push, and yes, the decolonization happens, and yes, broadly, the decolonization is complete, and so the AU is created. There's still 2 or 3 small cases that we need to focus on. Britain is finally coming round to handing the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius. And we've seen the news in the last few weeks, and that is a decolonization issue. And then we have the ongoing problems in Western Sahara that meant that Morocco for a long time was not a member of the AU because Western Sahara belonged to the Spanish. When they came out, Morocco, rather than offer independence, invades. Yeah. So those problems are still there. But on the whole, yes, the AU is created. The AU does recognize still that diaspora dimension. It's created a 6th region. So there are 5 regions of Africa. There's north, south, west, central, and the southern part. And now there's a 6th region, which is the diaspora. It hasn't worked out how it integrates that diaspora into the AU affairs. Haiti, for a long time, has been asking to become a member and has been refused. So how do you integrate the African Atlantic space if you're not going to admit those who suffered the historic legacies into the AU? So there are big challenges. And now there are other huge challenges. And the most interesting one I'm finding fascinating is what's going on in West Africa, where suddenly we had a fairly united ECOWAS. And now, because of this issue with the coups in Niger, you have a group of what in the old days we used to call those who work with imperialism wanting to invade, Niger. And you sit down and you think, well, there was a constitutional change of order in Rhodesia when Ian Smith declares independence. Everybody in the West works with him for, 14, 15 years to get back. And then overnight you want one group of Africans to attack another Africans to reverse a democratic, and you think, there's something going on. And then some of our leaders, I'm Nigerian, so I have to talk about mine, are in the leadership of this nonsense. As a result of Boko Haram, Niger hosts 120,000 displaced Nigerians. And you're going to go and attack them? But what do you think is going to happen in West Africa? And you're listening to France, who wants to buy uranium at
80 cents.
at 80 cents in the dollar instead of the market price of $200. And this is a discourse that you're entering into about how you resolve. Nobody wants coups, but that's not the way to resolve that issue. And the people who are pushing you to resolve that issue in that way do not have your interest at heart. And so suddenly you do have in West Africa now 3 or 4 countries who, in a strange kind of way, I wouldn't approve of because I'm not in favor of coups, but they're saying we're going to defend Africa. And that's Mali, Niger,
And Burkina Faso.
And interestingly, those countries are built on not the Berlin states of these borders that don't exist in Africa, really, but an old Songhai empire that is an African reality. So what I'm interested in is how we integrate the historic diaspora and how we actually get rid of these bloody borders and reorganize Africa to then defend African interests. Without that, there's no transformation. You'll have these guys who are, we've discovered in the last 2 weeks that our leader papers have been released in America. Our leader in Nigeria has issues to answer in America. And you wonder, was that the reason he's going along with all this nonsense? That has nothing to do with the interests of African people, but has to do with the interests of what in the old days we used to call imperialism, but we're not allowed to anymore. So, so it's a fascinating moment. And I think it's interesting to see how that evolves. But the other really amazing thing is just that the demographic changes that are happening in Africa are, incredible. By the end of the century, we'll probably have 40% of the world's population. And the young people are the ones who are not putting up with all of that old arrangement, because they're the ones who, unfortunately, have to cross the Sahara and try and get into Europe and take all those risks. And they're like, no, we want to stay at home and make sure that this country is run for our interests and not for other people's interests. So you've seen the enthusiasm, and I'm not saying these coups are going to work, and they will hit all the contradictions that these young officers always hit, and perhaps in 3 or 4 years' time, we'll be agitating for them to leave and move out again because they'll all get intoxicated by power and become more authoritarian. But for the moment, there's something very interesting that is going on.
I really like the point that he made about ECOWAS and that decision that Tinubu, the president of Nigeria, made to invade Niger to restore Bazoum, the disposed president, because that incident has threatened to both divide and unite Africa. So the division was ECOWAS deciding to invade. The Nigerian Senate said no. A lot of Nigerians are saying, why should we kill our neighbor? And then what I thought was fascinating was all the countries that surround Niger immediately said French army would not use their airspace to go in and attack Niger. And then Nigeria has an interest in this conflict because there's a pipeline, a $13 billion pipeline that Chevron has constructed that goes from Nigeria through Niger into Algeria, and it's supposed to be the replacement for Nord Stream for Europe and supplying gas to Europe. And so that's their interest in defending the economic, the pipeline. But also what I wanted to say is Nigeria immediately after this coup turned off the electricity of Niger. And Algeria, which typically, I'm sure most of you know that North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa have never really been united, but Algeria gave Niger electricity for free. And so you're seeing coming together at the same time as this divide and coming back to the African Union. For as long as we are not united, the African Union will never succeed. So how are we going to invade each other at the behest of France and not sticking with each other, especially when we know the issue of reason why the military staged that coup? Well, people say it's because the general was about to get fired, but the wider issue is that people are tired of not seeing development in their countries. And then we decide to go and invade.
On that issue of electricity, I mean, this is how absurd it is. Nigeria gives, or used to give Niger electricity for free so that Niger wouldn't dam the Niger. Yeah? So it was in our interest, and that was the reason we provide that. Because if Niger dams the Niger to get electricity, it would affect everything downstream. So you have a leader who his own national interests are not considered when he's making calculations. In the future, whichever government is in Niger, they are going to work for independence for the electricity because they will never, ever leave themselves in that situation. And then you cut off the access to the currency. We're trying to work towards a common currency in West Africa. Whichever government takes over again, why would they ever allow somebody else to control their currency?
Yeah.
So there are huge consequences that are happening and fragmentation as a result of foolish decisions. And the last lot of foolish decisions that both Nigeria, South Africa, and I think it was Gabon did was to vote for the resolution 1973, which overthrew Gaddafi. We understood, and I'm not saying that the West shouldn't have its interests. I'm arguing about how do we protect our interests. So the West wanted to overthrow Gaddafi for its own complex reasons, and then Nigeria, South Africa, and Gabon voted in favor of that resolution. And what was the consequence of that resolution? Gaddafi's armories are emptied, and you look at what happens with the insecurity across West Africa, from Boko Haram, all of them are armed now from Gaddafi's army. So you do something because you're having a conversation with the West about some things that are of interest to the West, and you're not considering your own vital interests. And here we are, France now has to come into Mali to deal with the insurgencies that it's created by destroying the Libyan state and the most successful African state on the continent.
Yeah.
And there are actually three consequences of the Libya of Gaddafi. It was the insurgent that came into into the Sahel region. It was the complete destruction of the Libyan state. And we saw that with the floods recently, where they were unable to respond. And then the third one is the migrant crisis. So everyone talks about, especially Europeans, are getting really agitated about the migrant crisis. And the Prime Minister of Italy has now been openly condemning Emmanuel Macron and saying it's because you're exploiting Africans that they're coming to Europe, because now Italy is bearing the brunt of all these people crossing the Mediterranean. But what people don't realize is Gaddafi was getting paid, I saw sums of $5 billion a year, including speedboats, to contain the migrant crisis in Africa. So migrants have always traveled through the Sahara from as far as Gambia, and apparently it takes 6 months. So they are sponsored, but they work in mines, they work on fields just to get to Libya. And then Gaddafi used to keep them in Libya. They'll get education, housing, and they'll literally settle. You take Gaddafi out, and then suddenly the gates of Africa to the Mediterranean are open, and you're complaining about migrants and people on boats coming across the Mediterranean. Let's hold people accountable. It is 2011, and that decision to take out Gaddafi that actually caused the three problems: the destruction of Libya, the migrant crisis in Europe, and the jihadists that are now in the Sahel region.
Yeah. So, as we can see, colonialism is still having an impact. And that's So, my final question I'm going to ask before we open up to Q&A, and just also hearing you talk, it's really clear that one of the main limitations of Africa is the countries. Right, I mean, these are made-up countries. There's 54. It didn't automatically segments people. Even in the Caribbean, like Barbados, Jamaica, we're all very, very proud of our national. When really, it's the region. We should be thinking regionally, not nationally, and this leads to lots and lots and lots of problems. Anyway, my question I wanted to ask was about reparations. And reparations, typically, interestingly, we think about reparations as the people who left Africa, but actually, in 1990, the OAU had a reparations demand as well. Slavery isn't bad for us. Slavery destroys the political economy of Africa as well. So I wonder if what role should reparations play, and can reparations actually be a campaign that brings the diaspora and the continent really together, I guess?
Well, the diaspora in Africa did come together. As you say, the OAU started the present movement for diaspora for reparations in the early 1990s, and Bernie Grant went to that meeting in Abuja, and there was another one in Lagos. They set up an eminent persons group that involved the diaspora in Africa, and the push began. And Bernie came back here and started the African reparations movement. And if you couple of years afterwards, I started something called African Remembrance Day. So there were all these things that were happening around the early 90s, and everyone's like, well, what's happening? Why now? Why is this reawakening? And then it was clear that what was happening was that, we talked about the Papal Bull in 55 or whenever it was, is that for this period you'd had an age of, as I said, dispossession, slavery, second-class citizenship and occupation. And by 94, this age comes to an end with South Africa, because that's the last time you have a European power with the arrogance and the audacity to codify African inferiority. And so everybody now starts looking back at what James Baldwin used to call the price of the ticket. Yeah? Haiti, the millions dead in the middle of the Atlantic, the colonization, the compensation always for those who did wrong. So Haiti has to give France loads of money, and it bankrupts Haiti for 100 years. The British planters get their billions. And then those who have been treated as they were as chattel and everything are sent out into the world with nothing. And this is a pattern, and even in South Africa, it ends with, in Zimbabwe, they keep the land. And then you're supposed to go out and eat freedom with no resources. So that's the conversation that happens, or starts to happen. We say, how can the lowest estimate is 2 million who died in the Atlantic. Some say as many as 10, 20 million. How can those millions have left the earth and there wasn't a monument? There wasn't a discussion? And then imperialism just walks on lively. And when you raise it, oh, you're talking about the past. No, this age ended in 94. So by 2001, we get to Durban and say, let's talk about crimes of humanity at the conference. The conference happens end of August 2001, ends September 8th. The momentum is building and we think it's going to happen. And then 3 days later, the towers come down. And then we spend 20 years in caves looking for and trying to manage the Muslims. And then we retreat from Afghanistan, and then George Floyd happens. And we're up. The 20 years is over. So the discourse is back. And it's not going away, because the measure of the freedom that we've won is that we can talk about what happened to us, and we want to talk about what happened to us. And so people now want to do that, and it's not going to go away. And you saw that intensity during the George Floyd, that trigger that brought all these issues back in the fore. So, yeah, I mean, I think the issues for reparations has never gone away. CARICOM developed their 10-point plan in 2014, but the momentum is unavoidable, because we all want to talk about it. And so I think it's really important. And as Africans, we've been trying to deal with a whole number of issues, remembrance. I call it the 10 R's. I mean, the first R was resistance, and we always resisted. But the second R, if we look at after the resistance, the ways that we've been trying to deal with it, then there's this issue of recognition, the first R. Because the people who did some of this to us don't even want to recognize that 2 million people at the bottom of the Atlantic, and the Atlantic is an African graveyard. And if we can't own the Atlantic as part of this discourse, who can? Yeah? So recognition, remembrance, restitution of our cultural artifacts, reparations, not just monetary, but holistic and how we heal ourselves. And those are the challenges with what we used to call imperialism. And then the challenges within ourselves, how we reconnect and how we return, like the Rastas have been trying to do, I end with a 10th R, which is about the kind of renaissance that the AU wants to do with its 2063 agenda. So how do we then rebuild? How do we solve the arguments and the problems that we have inside the African Atlantic space and the borders, some of the traitorous actions that happened. So it's a big agenda, and I think the reparations is really, really important, and we have to engage, the West and everything that you see happening. I think is a renegotiation of that Atlantic space, and we have to claim our contribution to it. Just if you look at what the music outside of the European tradition, what the music is inside that space, it's ours. Look at all the labor contributions and everything else. And the challenge we say to the other side is if those people were trafficked, kidnapped, and taken across in those huge numbers, if it wasn't about money and this global economy, then it was sadism. So if it's about money, let's have a conversation about that and then how we repair that. If not, I was on a platform with somebody from the Church of England recently. We perhaps should just leave that to God, because one wouldn't understand why that happened. But we have to have the recognition first that something happened, and that every time an African raises what they've been through or they're going through, somebody doesn't poke them in the chest and get angry. And you're like, why are you angry?
I think in terms of the whole reparatory justice debate, in 2020, we brought the Golden Motion at Bristol City Council. And but before we brought the motion, for me, it was really important for us to have a conversation with ourselves as people of African heritage communities, as well as people from the wider city, because I can tell you now, the vast majority of people who live in our city, including those who look like me, didn't even realize that we were even a slave city. Okay? So it's quite clear that on this whole journey, you have to be exactly where they are at. And that's why the work we're doing in Bristol around developing a kind of international story house and museum, because we have to tell the whole story, not half truths that have been told. When the Colston statue got pitched into the water, that's when everybody was like, wait a minute, I've been walking past that statue for all day, every day. I didn't know this man. My daughters went to Colston Girls' School, but my children always knew who they were. They never went to any of the commemoration ceremonies because I had educated them. But not every parent knows, so many people are just kind of struggling to live day to day. The reparations, and when you talk about reparatory justice, the first thing that everybody goes to is, oh, how much money, it's not my fault, can't you forget about it? But look at what is happening in the education system. I had a meeting last week with over 50 heads and mat chairs, and I put it on them. I said to them, the reason why we are seeing this school to prison pipeline, I said, you're responsible. It starts with you, because you're the ones who have no patience and are putting our children out of school. If you go back, when we're talking about repair, it isn't just about money. It is about, like I said, systemic and endemic racism that has perpetually kept us, people of African heritage, down. And I am so grateful to the new generation that are coming through. It was interesting, the whole voice survey that has come out that showed that over 50% of our young black people, they don't see Britain as their home. They want to live here. They want to, they know that they want to go home and fix what we've not been able to fix. Okay, so that's why I keep going back to the young ones are our future, and the two leaders in Mali. Yeah, I have so much respect for them, and I think they have garnered this newfound kind of respect and following from so many people, black and white, across the whole diaspora. But I think for us, it's really important that we also recognise that we also need to kind of celebrate. I always talk to people about celebrating Black excellence, celebrating our excellence. Many of you who are in this room, I was quoting as scholars and what have you. I always say to people, I have been doing this thing around EDI and disaffected and disadvantaged, but trust me, there's a whole diaspora out there who are kicking it in terms of academically, who are going to be brilliant leaders, who are going to run stuff, and we need to be celebrating that from right across the world. So in terms of particularly, I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the work that the World Reimagined are going to be doing, but the mayor Marvin had a vision about also about connecting the triangle and looking at how we kind of celebrate and it's not just always about memorialization. Let's celebrate what's best of the diaspora across the triangle. So hopefully working with the World Reimagined and mayors that we're connecting with right in America, in the Caribbean, Africa, and even Europe, will start to develop some stronger transatlantic links. We're not going to be able to address many of the challenges that we face, but we'll do our one little part, even if it's kind of artistically, creatively, and all of that. The bigger challenges around economy, yeah, that's a bigger fish to fry. But I think, like I said, all shoulders to the wheel, because I think it's a different movement. It feels different, and I'm of that older generation. And like I said, when I listen to my children, their partners, their friends talking about what could be and what could happen and their role in that, I actually feel quite very positive. I feel really good for the future of Africa in spite of itself.
So, in February 2021, there was a UN resolution on racism and elimination of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related violence that was tabled. And I think Russia was the sponsor. Israel was one of the countries that said we need to vote on this issue. And part of that agenda was reparation, racial justice, and the recognition of people of African descent. That resolution was vetoed by the US, the UK, Australia, France, Germany, Hungary, and interestingly, Israel as well.
What, they all vetoed it?
Huh?
They all vetoed it.
They vetoed it.
But
Interestingly, you had some former colonizers like Spain and Portugal that abstained, but then they're broke, so you can't get money from a broke. You can't get alimony from a broke partner. So they abstained. And what I thought was fascinating was reading the brief about why countries vetoed it. So the U.S. said, this is not steeped in international law. They cited Durban and said you can't force us to pay reparations. What I thought was very interesting when they said, well, you didn't talk about China and human rights abuses in China. It was a bill about Africa. The UK's response was also a bit interesting. They said we're focusing on our domestic situation and creating a society that promotes equality for all. And then that's what they said. It's in the bill. You can read it. I have links for all of this stuff. But the human rights ambassador came on a few weeks later and said, even though slavery and colonialism brought great suffering, they were not a violation of international law. So basically what the West was saying is, we don't want, so Durban, yes, you discussed it, but we don't owe you a dime, was the messaging from the UN resolution and the fallout from that. And when you look at So you mentioned Haiti before. Haiti had to pay the equivalent today of $560 million to France for the loss of plantations after slavery was abolished. And in 2010, they said to France, you need to pay us reparation of $17 billion for what you did. And France, of course, said no. When you look at my favorite globe outside, which says that the UK in 1837 borrowed 20 million pounds to pay slave owners as compensation, and it took 180 years to repay that. But on the other side, Africans have received either nothing or very little. So you look at anti-apartheid, the compensation was $3,900 per person after anti-apartheid. And if you've ever been to the Apartheid Museum in South Africa, you will be horrified by what people went through. In Kenya, the UK government paid 25 million pounds for 5,000 victims of Mau Mau uprising, which works out to $5,000 per person. So basically, Africans are saying it's about principle. If you're going to do reparations for other groups, you should really consider us. And I say other groups because Haiti paid compensation, but also Germany paid compensation for victims of the Holocaust. As of 2012, that number was $89 billion. They also paid Israel $7 billion in 1948 at the creation of the state. But Africa is getting nothing. And we're saying we need to be treated equally. And if we agree that slavery and colonialism were a crime against humanity, we need to be compensated for that. But when you see the numbers of what that compensation would look like, you kind of understand why the West is saying no. I saw a report in 2019 which said that number, when you take into consideration the benefits, could be as high as $17 trillion, which is a lot. And so the reality is we are not going to get reparations. So what do we do instead? So Haiti actually came up with a number. I was impressed that they came up with a number of 17 billion. And most countries are just saying reparations, without really saying what they want. So step one is, what is your number? What is your 17 billion that Haiti wants? And I'm a bit of a radical. So I always say if I was running my country and I had a number of $20 billion for Zambia, for example, for colonialism, the next time the IMF sent me a bill and said interest and principal, I'll say knock it off against the money you owe me. Because that tab of how much is owed by the West to Africa is growing. We have slavery and colonialism from historical, but now we've got climate change financing. So there was an agreement that developing countries will be compensated because the environment has largely been damaged by industrialization of the global north. Money is not forthcoming. Added to the tab. But we have to get radical in how we're negotiating. But that starts with knowing what is it that we're asking for. So we just say reparations. What's our number?
Can I just say, one of the things that's happening in Bristol, sorry.
I was just going to go
back. The merchant venturers are doing a piece of research into the families who benefited from the slave trade. And so once we kind of have a list of, we kind of know who they are, but they're doing the research so we can get the numbers and then we can use that to start having the conversations, because as you know, you have the families, the Trevelyan's, and everybody who are speaking out and wanting to do something. I think I've lost my train of thought. Then I'll go back to the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, the point I was going to make was just that I think it's not even about the money so much. It's also just looking at how the African is seen and conceptualized inside of the system. And there are two examples that I think are really evocative. And at the end of the 18th century, there are three revolutions. The American Revolution, that brings in this idea of, a new kind of constitutional order that doesn't involve the kings and queens. And then the French Revolution that brings in the concept of equality and fraternity and liberty. Yes? Mm-hmm. And then there's the Haitian Revolution. The French Revolution, and the American Revolution, despite being about freedom, continue with racial despotism. Yes? And then the Haitian Revolution happens in 1804 that actually gets rid of racial despotism and then is blockaded and punished. for doing that. And then the other two revolutions become the paradigm of how we celebrate freedom.
Yeah.
And the Haitians deal with the issue of race, racial despotism, but that's not an example about how you expand freedom. Instead, as you say, they're punished with by France. The Western world blockades them.
Mm.
And then we're surprised that Haiti is where it is today. So these terms, how we look at the African within this structure, and we have done more than most people in this Atlantic space to define freedom. It was actually sorted out on our backs. Yeah. Not as a theoretical principle, but as a practical, useful thing that you do. And then the other very quick example is from your city, where a guy is responsible for the deaths of 18,000 people that he trafficked across the Atlantic, and he has a statue up to him. What is going on?
All right, I'm going to have to just interrupt quickly because we're really running out of
Yes,
time.
you are.
And I'm going to can I ask you to bring this into the question when you answer it.
Okay, cool.
So don't leave it, but I want to make sure we have some Q&A time.
Okay,
So just
cool.
keep it and then bring it into the question on the Q&A. Yeah. So we had different, because I know we're running. I'm getting lots of looks.
Way over time. Very interesting. But has anyone got any questions in the room? Quite a few.
Okay.
Not for me.
I think you did put your hand up first.
Oh, thank you. I want a question for Asha, really, to follow up. My name's Nick Owen from a charity in Leicester called Mighty Creatives. We work using arts and culture to improve young people's lives. So I really want to just hear a bit more what you're saying about that faith in the younger generation, which I think is absolutely spot on, because that's where our hope is. And I wondered what signs you're getting from children and young people that goes, actually, this is how things can change for the better. What's happening you're picking up? Is it happening in schools or is it outside school?
So one of the things I will say is that the murder of George Floyd was a real turning point for so many people in the city. And because we were also in the middle of COVID, everyone was still. You couldn't avoid what we were seeing in the newspaper. You can avoid it when you're going about your business on the day-to-day and just think, okay, another murder another racist murder in America. But everybody saw cold-blooded murder of a black man, racism. You couldn't run away from it. And we found that during that time, a lot of our staff, so we employ 6,500 staff, and we were all working from home. And we were running the city literally from laptops from our dining room table. But what was coming through quite clearly was staff wanted to talk about what was happening. And obviously we're not connecting, we're not at work, so people can't have the little conversations in the corridors. So we organised an online event and conversation. We also made loads and loads of resources available. We have school teachers, and I have to give props to those white school teachers who didn't even come from Bristol. They were next door in South Gloucestershire. Again, they had a light bulb moment to say, hold on a minute, we've been teaching about the slave trade, but from our perspective, we're getting it completely wrong. So they actually rewrote their whole curriculum across South Gloucestershire, shared it with Bristol, and so schools are now using that, and they worked with some of our black school teachers to to deliver and create a new kind of curriculum. And so there's lots of work happening around the curriculum, changing the curriculum. The voices of young people have to be front and center. We found that it was the Black Lives Matter movement, and it was the youth themselves who were saying things have got to change, things have got to be different. And I think just going back to the point around reparatory justice, the point I was trying to make was that everyone keeps coming to me because I chair Bristol Legacy Foundation, which I created because so many people in the city wanted to do something about slavery. And I was like, hold on a minute here, let's try and coordinate, let's try and come together, let's not all go off on different tangents. And so we formed the foundation, and it's run by people of African heritage communities, and then our stakeholders, the local authority, the merchant venturers, the university, the church, and others, key stakeholders, they join us every other meeting because they're doing lots of work. But they always come to me and say, Sinasha, what do you need? What do you want? And I say, I keep saying to them, well, I visited the museum in the Holocaust Museum. That was a really moving kind of feat. They spent 65 million just on the extension to the original for the Holocaust Museum. And I thought, that's kind of set the bar for me. So I'm like, we're going to need at least 50 million because of what it is we want to do. But I don't necessarily want any money from you. I'm like, you guys, including the council, are one of the biggest landowners here in this city, and you owe us big. So I set them the challenge. Find me or donate, whatever you call it, bequeath a legacy to people of African heritage to say this is a piece of land. You know, me and the mayor are looking at spaces around the city. People want it near the water. So we're kind of looking and seeing that everyone has got to put, like I said, their shoulder to the wheel. Then we will ask them for the money, but first and foremost is we own lots of land and lots of assets between ourselves, the university and everybody else. So, hey, give something up. Name changing of different houses and statues and all of that is not going to repair the injustice that our communities continue to feel. So,
Another question here.
yeah, sorry.
Anyway,
Go ahead.
sorry, yeah, my name is Tabo Malaya. I'm from Zimbabwe, South Africa. So congratulations to this new beautiful building. So the first question I was gonna, is a comment, is named Rhodes House. And if I can quote the speaker when we talk about the symbols, I don't know if you know what that bird represents.
I don't.
See, it's
Zimbabwe
a Zimbabwean bird, yeah.
It's called
Yeah,
Yeah. So for it to have this and to say this Rhodes House, and you're taking something that came from the Monomotapa, the Great Zimbabwe, and it's being used as a Rhodes House. I don't know. I'm just going to throw that to you as a panel, how you see it. And I also done some work with the retrievers when you're talking about the instruments and some of the artifacts within the museums and how they're labeled. And we're trying to change how they're called, because when they were procured, they were given the names like Kalimba, like if you know the musical instrument from Zimbabwe called Mbira, but how it's called here is called a tampiano. So we did the work to change that, so that when people come in, they know the history of that instrument, vice versa, how it was, how they were procured. Yeah, and then also the other thing that I want to allude to when you're talking about the land reform, because we talk about people like Julius Malema, and Zimbabwe is under sanctions because they said what maketh the people is the land. When people went to war, they fought for the land, you know, and I remember exactly what you spoke about. And my sister from Zambia used to be called Rhodesia and Nyasaland. Yeah, so I don't know if thank you for
pointing those things out. Does anyone want to respond? Because we have some more questions there. I feel like you educated us today.
And we're also representing the Rhodes House here. But what it represents is the West form of colonialism.
Exactly. So
for us to have that Rhodes House within whatever we're talking about now, what are your feelings? What are your thoughts?
if the truth be known, I have no feelings at this, because that's not going to change what's going on. You know, the whole debate that we've had about statues and no statues, that statue may, the Colston statue may never have come down if, because we had actually agreed that the wording for what should have been on the statue around Colston, telling the truth that he was a slaver, not this benefactor who built all these schools or what have you. But then the merchants decided to interfere with the process and water down the words. So when they presented it to me and Marvin, we just said, no, it's not going to happen. And then 2 years later, the statue came down because we said we're not going to put this wishy-washy, the man is a slaver. Tell the city that the man is a slaver and he is responsible for the deaths of many, many people. So yeah, words kind of matter, and I suppose even in the work that we're doing around the Bristol Legacy Foundation, we've just agreed our own branding, and we've made Bristol really little, Legacy really large, and we've put the Sankofa bird in the middle of the O for Bristol. You'll soon see it. We're going to launch it. But when it was first presented, my initial reaction is no, make Bristol really small because this is about legacy. We want people to understand what we stand for, but then the nod to the Sankofa bird, that was one of the words that came forward. Should we call ourselves the Sankofa Foundation? I said no, let's keep it as it is, but let's, again, we made this decision, and that's the thing with the statue. Is it was white men in a room, Smithfield room, having a conversation. Oh, let's put up a statue to Colston. Even the wider city didn't even know who Colston was or had any say in the matter of any of the statues that went up in the city. But now, as we move forward around legacy, we're having that conversation with people of African heritage and the wider city, and being as transparent as we can be about what we're going to do when we look at what legacy looks like, memorialisation, the story house, the use of the plinth and how that's going to be worked, and bringing our globes back to the city. They'll be the first things that are going to be on display as part of the journey that we're going to be on over the next 10 years.
Can I just add very, very quickly on that? I mean, this is a process. We're here in Rhodes House, and I didn't ever think I'd be here, but here I am having a conversation. And it seems to me that we're on that first we're beginning to have the recognition, the acknowledgement, and talking about things that have happened. And I always sort of liken this process to, that very popular stages of grief where, people get angry and then they, before they go through all the different stages and then you get acceptance. Yeah. So in the population, different people are at different stages of that process. So there are a lot of people I meet, they're just angry, they won't even talk about it. Other people are beginning that process of sort of saying, okay, let's have the conversation, and the conversation deepens. And then as you do that, these symbols, you can approach those symbols and those ideas and to talk about how those affect you. There was a woman in Bristol, she may be a colleague of yours, and she said something that always struck with me. She said, when my parents came over as part of the Windrush generation, they saw the statues to Colston, and they just looked at it 75, 50 years ago, and they were puzzled as to why this man was being commemorated. But they didn't say anything. For them, it was just, okay, the British are interesting people, and they moved on. In the 1990s, we went to Bristol with the Remembrance Day. We met with the Lord Mayor, and we said, why are there statues all over this city to people who committed vile atrocities and none to the victims? And he had no answer. And we started a process where they started the conversation, and they put up is it the Pettus Bridge? Pero Bridge, and the Bristolians took on the challenge. And then fast forward 30 years later, and nothing happens, as you say, because they were even just talking about a plaque for 30 years.
Yeah. For real.
On whether this guy was a slave or not, and he obviously was. But they wouldn't do that. And then 30 years later, the statue comes down in 5 minutes.
Okay, I think we're gonna take a quick comment, and then we're gonna go. How long we got left? How long we got left?
How long have we got, Babette?
Couple more. All right. So I know you
I'll
want to
just briefly respond because I am a Zambian Rhodes Scholar, and Zambia was Rhodesia. When Cecil died, Zambia was part of Rhodesia with Zimbabwe, and then became Northern Rhodesia. And I remember when I got the scholarship back in 2001, and people said to me, "How can you get a scholarship that bears the name of Cecil Rhodes?" Now, I speak as an individual Rhodes Scholar. I never make excuses for what Cecil Rhodes was and did. He was a white supremacist. He helped to colonize Southern Africa. Well, most Southern Africa for the British government. And part of the reason why, yes, in this building, which I personally love, I work here, and so there's always the community is very divided about. And Africans and Zambians and Zimbabweans in general are very divided about Cecil and his legacy. So people said to me, "How can you take a scholarship with Cecil's name and his money?" And I said, "I don't see this as Cecil's money. He made his money in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and in Zambia. So I see it as me taking back money from my ancestors. So it's a point at which you're looking at this. And so people say, okay, so that was the first thing. I said, I'm not taking Cecil's money, I'm taking back our money. So with the name, again, the community is always divided. Should we keep the name Rhodes? And this is where I'm different from the whole Bristol conversation. I get why people be upset about the statue, but I'm like, we're not going to change history by renaming the house Rhodes House. So I'm personally very indifferent. I have no qualms with that. When I see the Zimbabwe bird, I remember that Cecil is buried in Matopos Hill. Like, he loved that place so much that he wanted to be buried there. I think there was a saying, which I will misquote if I try to say it, but he wanted to be buried in Africa and specifically in Rhodesia. And that's why that bird meant so much. And if you go to his properties, that bird is everywhere. So it was symbolic to him. And for me as an African, where we have 104 scholars who come here from all over the world every year, seeing that and learning that this is a Zimbabwean bird and the money came from Africa, it is a reminder for me to everybody that this wealth came from Southern Africa. And when I came in 2002, I remember meeting an American Rhodes Scholar who said to me, "Why are you here? Why are there Zambian Rhodes Scholars?" I said, "Where do you think the money came from?" So that bird for me is really important because it puts the pin on Africa in this building. The bird sits atop this building. And for as long as people know this is a Zimbabwean bird and the reason for it is this building would not have existed were it not for Africa, I'm okay with it. So personally, I'm okay with the scholarship. I'm okay with the name Cecil, but I want the recognition that Africa contributed to the foundations of this building.
Thank you. Yeah. Got time for a couple more?
Someone has the mic.
Okay.
This all resonates with me incredibly so, because I'm the son of a Zimbabwe farmer. I was educated in Zimbabwe. I was born on a farm. My father spoke 6 African languages. I worked for Anglo-American. I was the company secretary. I submitted the annual return of the BSA company in Harare. And I love Zimbabwe.
Oh,
and I want to ask a question. Someone said that Africa needs money. But someone said to me, don't give African money. Rather buy him a tool and help him discover his own beauty. So that's my question.
Wait, the question, this sounds like a philosophy question at Oxford. So the question is what? We shouldn't get money, we should get tools instead?
Discover their own beauty through a tool.
How am I going to buy the tool if I don't have any money?
Thank you. Any more questions? Sorry.
I'll try very much to make it brief. My name is Ni Anubi. I'm a construction professional, but I'm retired, so I no longer work where I have time to do this. In terms of reparation, one of the things that occurs to me that we're not actually focusing on, I think a lot of African money is actually in this economy. Mm-hmm. And I think we can clearly relate to getting our money back. What happens to a lot of that money, in reality, goes to European banks and the people that actually put it there illegally die, and nobody can claim the money back. And therefore, the economies in Europe are actually benefiting from money that's being laundered from Africa, whichever way you put it. And I think when we think in terms of reparation, one of the biggest aspects of reparation, which I think I probably suffer from first, is not just the financial legacy that slavery has put us on, is actual psychological damage. And I think that's one area where it appears to me that's just not considered, as if it doesn't matter the way the Africans feel or black people feel is not an issue. I think we need to start a different fight to take back what is ours, what we actually created. And I'd be very surprised if we're not talking over hundreds of billions of actual African money in this economy that's just there. And apparently the banks just take it because people disappear and die. What does the panel think about that?
So actually, he's not making this up, by the way. So every year, Nigeria gets billions of dollars back from Abacha money. Apparently, it's become the flows of Abacha. So Sani Abacha was the president of Nigeria from when? Was it the 90s?
In the 90s.
The last dictator, military dictator of Nigeria. And he stole hundreds of billions of dollars. And every year, the Nigerian government, it's almost like a dividend from corruption, gets billions of dollars of money that they found, bank accounts in Switzerland, in the UK, wherever, of Abacha money. So you are right. There's tons of money sitting here, but we need to find where the flows are. So we need to go back into our records. We're not very good at record keeping, actually. So we don't even know where the money went to. We don't keep records, but there is money. And you're right. Maybe that's one of the low-hanging fruit that we need to start fighting for.
Where do you think the money goes? I mean, we talk about corruption. The money goes somewhere. It's coming here, right? We don't. Yeah. So I think I'm being told we have to wrap up. So I think we're hanging around. There's a reception at the end.
There is. Before that begins, I'd like to thank everyone on the panel today. Could we please clap for them?
Yes, thank you.
I learned so much today. Thank you so much. I'm the co-founder of the World Reimagined, and we started with just one mission, is to try to make racial justice a reality. And we felt that you needed to know more about the past. Am I right with this mic? We felt that you needed to know more about the past and the true history of Britain's contribution to the enslavement of Africans before we could move forward in an equitable manner. From August to October last year, over 3.7 million people interacted with our globes. There were 103 of them across 7 cities. A lot of the evaluation reports that came back told us that over 90% felt they knew so much more about the enslavement of Africans than when they began. And that very much informed us that we've still got work to do, because once you know better, as Maya Angelou says, you've got to do better. And so we now know at least 3.7 million people know better. Bear in mind that we had over 250 schools. Many of them took on our educational module as part of their curriculum. So again, when you talk about recognition, Onyekachi, it's so important that people understand why Black people need their contributions to this country recognized. It's humanizing, but it also builds empathy. And we saw in real time when people saw those globes, one family on one side who were Black, a family on another side that were white, going, oh my God, that child was 5 years old and enslaved in Antigua. And conversations happening in real time with people that would never have spoken to each other before about anything, let alone about the enslavement of Africans. That we see as part of our work. And so when you talk about Rhodes Trust and coming here, we had to think about that as an organization. And we said to ourselves, if you don't talk to the people who have benefited from white supremacy, how can we move forward? So I gave Rhodes Trust the challenge of, will you allow us to hold you accountable? Because if you're willing to be held accountable, we can work with you. If this is just to wallpaper over what you've done in the past, we're not interested. And Rhodes Trust Thank you. Rose Trust very much show the willingness to be held accountable and to do the work. And we're still doing that work, which is why we're here. Rose Trust has never done this type of talk on this subject. They didn't control it. They didn't tell us what we could say. They didn't try to guide what the question we were asking. They just said, come and be the world reimagined. And so very much we intend to continue our work by bringing that conversation to the present. And that's, I think Councillor Asher Craig was alluding to that. And very much of that present is about addressing the inequalities across the African diaspora, but mostly across that Atlantic triangle. And again, it's not just money. It's about recognition. It's about being able to showcase your talent in front of the people that buy. You need access to be able to make money. Like you said, tools. I think Africa knows how their beauty. I don't think Africa doubts what they have. I think Africa is very aware of their talents. But do they have access to people who can see their talents? And this is what the new project with the World Reimagined will be about. And we'll be very much actively trying to redefine that Atlantic triangle so that currently I see it as one of pain. I want my great-grandchild to see it as one of progress. And we will continue doing that work until that happens. So thank you very much for tonight. I'm going to leave you with a poem written by Keisha Thompson called The World Reimagined, just giving you an idea of what we're about as an organization. But thank you very much for coming out tonight.
In order to reimagine something, you need to understand what it is first. I thought the world was equivalent to the earth, but when you check the definition, the world means all of human activity. It's not about the physical globe, but about the physical nature of humanity. I guess that's where I've been going wrong. I've been trying to reimagine the world on my own, but it doesn't belong to me. You're not an ink drop on this lonely narrator's tongue. If I close my eyes this time, will you promise to come with me? You see, a dream is like a cloud, it's deceptively heavy. The imagination is far too vast for one person to explore. So come with me, whilst I try to reimagine once more. To reimagine means to take a mental picture, to take something that exists and put it in a different context, like a Benin bronze in a British Museum cabinet. See, I don't really want to make mistakes of the past. I want to make compost of inherited hate, and circular debates frustrate my fears until they're surpassed. So I guess that's where the re-bit comes in. Re means to go backwards and start again. For too long, we've been singing a song of denial and discomfort, tonsils thronging with the discordant sounds of a legacy gone wrong. We all make mistakes, but when you make a wrong turn, you can't keep driving straight, looking for change. So put me off. I won't be fueled by misguided pride and polished shame. I can no longer close my eyes when there's so much work to do. Put the nose back on the Sphinx. Take the myth out of Timbuktu. I want to reach down the back of the sofa of this society and fish around for all that loose change. Like Aloda Equiano to slavery's abolition, Samuel Coleridge Taylor to the classical music composition, Princess Sophia Dilip Singh to the suffragettes. You don't have to go far to see how easy it is to forget. No wonder my eyes don't want to invest in frivolous fiction when there's so much fact waiting for its recognition. I thought I could fix things by simply asking you to join me in the dark room of humanity, but photography, it's not a row of negatives waiting to be seen. It's about exposing what has already been. To reach the unknown, you have to retrieve, recall, rewild, reinstall, repurpose, repair, go back to the beginning, start again, but now do it with flair. The world reimagined is a lotus bud waiting to unfold. The world reimagined is bubble bath in the hands of a 5-year-old. The world reimagined is our story untold. And telling it won't be easy, But that doesn't mean it can't be fun. We can turn fossils into plectrums, reject all that humdrum stuff fed to us without question. No suggestion that the truth is a spectrum. If you're the Berlin Wall, I'll be the graffiti. If you're a scroll, I'll be the words of Rumi, because there's no song outside of our vocal range. If I set my mind to it, my voice is louder than climate change. So take a step back. Use what's there. Make it new. Duchamp's masterpiece Fountain was an upgraded loo, and it was actually discovered by a baroness called Elsa, to be completely honest with you. Like a Rorschach image, we all start from the same place, then come out with different perspectives, and where we've gone wrong in the past is our failure to respect this. The World Reimagined is a gallery of things we were not sold. The World Reimagined is a humble alchemist's gold. The World Reimagined is our story untold.